There's something wrong with you. Not broken, just programmed. You don't chase what's good for you, you chase what you can't have. Think about it. The last person you couldn't stop thinking about, was it because they were there for you, or because they weren't? Because they pulled back, and something inside you snapped, not gently, violently. You called it love, you called it connection. You told yourself it was real, but what if it wasn't? What if the intensity you felt was never about them at all? What if your desire was engineered? Not by them, not consciously, but by something older than you, older than civilization itself, a system in your brain that confuses absence with value and turns uncertainty into obsession. This isn't about relationships. This isn't about dating. This is about the hidden system that decides what you want, who you chase, and why you can't let go. And here's the truth no one tells you. Scarcity doesn't reveal value, it creates it. You weren't chasing something rare, you were chasing a mirage. And the most dangerous part? The mirage knew exactly how to keep you running. By the end of this, you won't just understand desire, you'll see through it. But first, you need to see the wound. Chapter 1. The Wanting Machine. You were never in control. You think you chose them. You think you decided, at some point, consciously, rationally, freely, that this person, this thing, this life you keep reaching for was worth wanting. You constructed a whole internal narrative around it. You have reasons, good ones. You can list them if someone asks. You've probably already rehearsed them without realizing it. But here is the truth that this entire book is built on, and it will feel uncomfortable the moment it lands. You didn't choose your desire chose you. And it chose you using a system so old, so deeply embedded in the biological architecture of what you are, that calling it yours is almost generous. The wanting was there before the reasoning. The pull existed before the justification. You felt it first. In your chest, in your gut, in that wordless lurch towards something. And then, milliseconds later, your conscious mind scrambled to catch up and explain it as if it had been in charge all along. It wasn't. It never is. This is not a metaphor. This is not philosophy. This is neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and a pattern that has been playing out in human behavior since long before we had words for what we were doing. The part of your brain responsible for desire, the limbic system, the dopaminergic reward pathways, the ancient subcortical structures that predate language, culture, and civilization itself, operates on a completely different timeline than your conscious thought. By the time you think you want something, the decision has already been made somewhere deeper and darker than you have access to. You are not the author of your wanting. You are the narrator who arrives after the story has already begun. Sit with that for a moment. Really sit with it. Because most people read a sentence like that and feel a flicker of resistance. No, something inside them says, I know what I want, I know why I want it. And that resistance, that immediate, almost reflexive pushback, is itself part of the system. The machine doesn't just generate desire. It generates the certainty that the desire is yours. It makes you feel like the architect of something you are actually just the inhabitant of. Think about the last time you became obsessed with something you couldn't have. Don't sanitize it. Don't pick the safe example. Pick the real one. The person who didn't text back. The opportunity that slipped through your fingers. The version of your life you keep orbiting without ever quite landing in. Remember how it felt? That specific texture of wanting. Urgent, consuming. A little desperate even when you told yourself you were being calm about it. Now ask yourself, when exactly did it intensify? Was it when things were easy and reciprocal and available? Was it when the path was clear and the outcome seemed assured? Or was it the moment something shifted? When availability became uncertainty? When presence became distance? When yes started to feel like maybe? You already know the answer. You've always known it. You just haven't been willing to look directly at what it means. The wanting machine doesn't run on value. It runs on scarcity signals. It runs on the perception, even a brief, ambiguous, completely manufactured perception that something might be slipping away. And the moment it detects that signal, it doesn't politely suggest that you might want to pay attention. It floods your system. It narrows your focus. It makes the uncertain thing feel like the only thing in the room. This is not a character flaw. Let that be clear. This is not evidence that you are weak or irrational or embarrassingly susceptible to manipulation. This is what kept your ancestors alive in an environment of genuine scarcity, where food, safety, and social belonging were constantly at risk. The brain that responded intensely to the threat of losing something was the brain that survived. The brain that shrugged at scarcity died with it. You are the descendant of the people who lunged. The problem, the real problem, the one that quietly destroys modern human relationships and decision-making and self-worth, is that this ancient survival mechanism cannot distinguish between a predator on the savannah and someone who takes 6 hours to respond to your message. It cannot tell the difference between a food source disappearing and a person becoming emotionally unavailable. It registers withdrawal and it sounds an alarm, and that alarm feels indistinguishable from the feeling of profound caring. That is the first thing you need to understand. The intensity of what you feel is not always proportional to the actual value of what you're chasing. Sometimes, and this is the part that cuts, the intensity is inversely proportional. The less available something becomes, the more violently the machine responds. The more uncertain the outcome, the more cognitive and emotional resources get redirected toward obtaining it, which means there is an uncomfortable possibility living at the center of your most powerful attachments. Some of what you believed was love, or passion, or ambition, or unshakable conviction may have been a neurological alarm, a caveman's fear dressed in contemporary clothes. An ancient system misreading a modern signal and responding with the full force of a survival instinct that has no idea it's been misdeployed. This doesn't mean your feelings weren't real. They were real. Real feelings, real intensity, real pain, but the trigger for those feelings, that deserves much closer examination than most people are willing to give it. Here is what happens when you don't examine it. Keep moving through life, interpreting the pull as proof of the value. You mistake the chase for the connection. You confuse the alarm for the truth. And the machine, because it is a machine, because it operates without conscience or agenda or awareness, just keeps running, generating desire, generating urgency, pointing you toward the unavailable and whispering, with complete confidence, this one is worth it. And the part of you that wants to believe it, that needs to believe it, listens over and over and over. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from this. You felt it. It sits underneath the wanting, quieter but heavier, the strange tiredness of chasing things that keep retreating, of pouring energy into uncertainty, of being perpetually oriented toward what isn't here yet rather than what already is. That exhaustion is not weakness, it's data. It's your system finally starting to notice the cost of running a program that was never designed for this environment. But noticing the cost is not the same as understanding the code. You are still, right now, at the beginning of that understanding. And what comes next, in the chapters that follow, is not going to make your wanting go away. It is going to do something far more dangerous than that. It is going to show you exactly how it works. And once you see that, once the mechanism is fully visible, you will never be able to unsee it. The wanting will still come. The pull will still happen. But the story you tell yourself about it will be irrevocably different. Whether that feels like freedom or loss depends entirely on how attached you are to the illusion that you were ever in control to begin with. The machine has been running your whole life. The only question now is whether you're finally ready to look at it. Chapter 2. The moment it became precious. How scarcity rewires the brain. It wasn't special before you thought you might lose it. That's the sentence most people can't bring themselves to finish. Because finishing it means admitting something that unravels a significant portion of their emotional history. Every obsession, every desperate chase, every sleepless night spent orbiting something that, if they're honest, wasn't particularly extraordinary until the moment it started to slip away. But here is the thing about truth. It doesn't wait for your comfort. The object didn't change. The person didn't change. The opportunity didn't suddenly reveal hidden depths you'd previously missed. What changed was a single variable, availability, and your brain, in response, performed a kind of silent alchemy. It reached into its ancient chemical toolkit and began flooding your system with signals that said, with complete neurological authority, this matters now. This matters more than it did yesterday. Pay attention, don't let go, and you listened. You always listen, because when your brain speaks in neurochemistry, it speaks in a language that bypasses every rational thought you have ever had. This is the mechanics of scarcity. And once you understand them, truly understand them, not just intellectually, but in your bones, you will start to see them operating everywhere. In the store window that says only 3 left. In the relationship that turned electric the moment the other person became less certain. In the life you suddenly, urgently wanted the day it felt like it might not be possible. Let's go back to a specific moment. You don't have to tell anyone. Just locate it. There was something or someone that existed in your life in a state of easy, uncomplicated availability. Maybe you even took it for granted a little. Not cruelly, not consciously. Just the natural way humans fail to assign full weight to what they can have at any moment. It was there. You knew it was there. And that knowledge, paradoxically, invisibly, made it feel less essential than things you hadn't secured yet. And then something shifted. Availability contracted. A door started to close, or felt like it was closing. And in that precise moment, not before it, not after it, but in that exact threshold moment, something in you woke up, hard, fast, with urgency that felt like revelation, but was actually closer to panic wearing revelation's clothes. Suddenly it was precious. Suddenly it was irreplaceable. Suddenly you could enumerate every quality it had with a clarity and passion that had been entirely absent when it was easily yours. What happened? What actually mechanically happened? Your brain detected a scarcity signal, and it responded the way it has been responding to scarcity signals since the first humans were navigating an environment where scarcity meant death. Dopamine pathways activated. Not in the calm, satisfied way they activate when you receive something good, but in the urgent, searching, I need to solve this way they activate when a reward is uncertain. Cortisol entered the equation, adding a thin layer of stress that sharpened your focus and narrowed your attention. Norepinephrine spiked, making everything feel more vivid, more important, more saturated with meaning. This is the neurochemistry of wanting, and it is in its own way a form of intoxication. The problem, and it is a serious problem, though it hides behind the feeling of passion, is that this chemical state is not neutral. It does not simply make you more motivated, it makes you less accurate. It distorts your perception of value in a specific, consistent, measurable direction. Upward. Everything you are chasing while this system is activated feels more valuable than it actually is. More rare, more significant, more worthy of the cost you are paying to pursue it. Psychologists call this scarcity bias. The term is almost too clinical for what it actually does to a human life. Think about what it means, really. It means your brain has a built-in mechanism that inflates the perceived value of things based not on their actual worth, but on their availability. It means you are constitutionally inclined, wired structurally at a level below choice, to want the hard to get more than the freely given, the uncertain more than the reliable, the closing door more than the open one. And here is where it gets dark. This mechanism doesn't know the difference between scarcity that is real and scarcity that is performed. It cannot distinguish between something that is genuinely rare and something that has simply been made to feel rare through timing, withdrawal, or controlled availability. The neurochemical response is identical. The feeling of precious urgency is the same. Your system cannot tell whether the door is actually closing or whether someone has simply learned that the sound of a closing door makes you lean in. That is not a comforting thought. It shouldn't be. Because once you know it, once you really sit inside that knowledge, you start to look back at certain chapters of your life with different eyes. The relationship that consumed you, was it genuinely extraordinary? Or did it become extraordinary the moment the other person learned, consciously or not, to be slightly less available? The opportunity you grieved for years, was it truly irreplaceable? Or were you responding to the scarcity signal with an intensity that had no relationship to the actual loss? There is grief in this realization. Real grief. Because it asks you to consider that some of the most vivid emotional experiences of your life may have been, in part, a chemical event rather than an accurate perception of reality. That what you were feeling was not always meaning, it was mechanism. But stay here for a moment before you move away from the discomfort. Because there is something else operating in this space, something that sits just beneath the scarcity response and is even more unsettling when you finally see it. The inflation of value under scarcity is not random. It doesn't choose its targets arbitrarily. The things your brain decides are worth the urgency, worth the obsession, worth the chemical override. Those choices are shaped by something deeper than the scarcity signal itself. They are shaped by the specific architecture of your particular history, with loss, with love, with what you learned very early on about what it means when something starts to pull away. Scarcity doesn't just tell you something is valuable. It activates a story you've been carrying for a very long time. And that story, quiet, invisible, running in the background of every wanting you have ever done, is what the next chapters are going to ask you to look at directly. For now, just notice this. The next time something feels suddenly more precious, more urgent, more irreplaceable than it did yesterday, ask one question before you lunge toward it. What changed? Because if the answer is anything other than the thing itself, if what changed was only its availability, then you are not feeling value. You are feeling the machine, and the machine, as you are beginning to understand, has been running experiments on you your entire life. Chapter 3. The lie you told yourself. Rationalizing the irrational? You didn't figure out that it was special. You decided it was special. And then you built a courtroom around that decision and spent months, maybe years, calling witnesses to the stand to prove what you had already, quietly, irrevocably concluded before the first piece of evidence was ever examined. This is not an accusation. It is a description of how the human mind actually works. But the fact that it's universal doesn't make it harmless. And the fact that you've been doing it your whole life doesn't mean you've ever fully seen it happening in real time. Let's be precise about what occurs, mechanically, sequentially. In the moments after desire is triggered, the wanting comes first. We established that in the previous chapters. The pull, the lurch, the sudden orientation towards something or someone. That happens below the level of thought, faster than language, in a part of your brain that has no interest in being reasonable. And then, in the fraction of a second that follows, something else kicks in. Something that thinks of itself as the responsible adult in the room. Your conscious mind arrives at the scene, looks at what has already happened, and immediately begins constructing the story that explains it. Not questions it, explains it, justifies it. Retroactively transforms a neurological event into a meaningful narrative about who you are and what you value and why this particular thing deserves the full force of your attention and energy. Psychologists have a name for this process. They call it confabulation, the brain's tendency to generate plausible explanations for its own behavior without having actual access to the real reasons behind that behavior. The explanation feels true. It feels internally coherent and emotionally honest, and like something you consciously arrived at through careful consideration. But it was constructed after the fact, to fit a conclusion that was already reached. You were not a detective uncovering truth. You were a lawyer defending a verdict that had already been handed down. Now locate the specific lie you told yourself. You know the one. It had a particular flavor. A kind of internal monologue that felt like insight but functioned like permission. Maybe it sounded like I've never connected with anyone this deeply. Maybe it was this opportunity is once in a lifetime. Maybe it was quieter than that. Just a pervasive sense of certainty. A feeling of knowing that was so strong, it felt like it couldn't possibly be wrong. And the more irrational the wanting actually was, the less it held up under any kind of objective scrutiny. The more elaborate the story became. This is the pattern. The greater the gap between what you were feeling and what could be rationally justified, the harder your mind worked to close that gap with narrative. You didn't construct a simple explanation. You constructed an architecture. A whole internal world where the wanting made perfect sense, where every piece of contradictory evidence was reframed or absorbed or quietly discarded. You became, without realizing it, an unreliable narrator of your own life. Think about someone you pursued, long past the point where the pursuit made any sense. Not the sanitized memory, the real one, with all its texture. Remember the specific arguments you made to yourself. Remember how you explained away the red flags. How you reinterpreted the moments of coldness or absence or inconsistency as evidence of depth rather than warning. Remember how invested you became in the story. How much of your identity got quietly tangled up in the idea that what you were feeling was accurate, that the object of your wanting was genuinely worthy of everything you were giving it. And now, with distance, with a particular clarity that only time provides, ask yourself how much of what you believed about that situation was true, and how much of it was a story you needed to be true because the alternative was too destabilizing to sit with. The alternative being, I am chasing something I can't have, and the primary reason I am chasing it is because I can't have it. That sentence is almost impossible to say to yourself in the middle of the wanting. Not because it's complicated, because it's humiliating. And the mind, above almost everything else, protects against humiliation. It will construct literally any alternative narrative, rather than allow you to see yourself as someone who has been pulled around by a mechanism they didn't choose and couldn't control. So it gives you a better story. A story where you are perceptive, where you recognize something real that others missed, where your desire is evidence of your emotional intelligence and your depth of feeling and your capacity for a kind of connection that most people are too shallow to understand. And the story is good. It is genuinely impressively good, because you are the one who wrote it and you are not stupid. You are creative and emotionally sophisticated, and you know yourself, or you know the version of yourself that the story requires. You populate the narrative with real memories, real details, real moments that genuinely happened. You just arrange them in a way that supports the verdict rather than examining it. This is what makes the rationalization so impenetrable from the inside. It isn't fabricated from nothing. It's real material, carefully curated. Here is the darker layer, the one that sits underneath the rationalization itself and is almost never examined. The story doesn't just explain the wanting, it protects it. Because if the story collapses, if you allow yourself to see clearly that the desire was triggered by scarcity, that the specialness was a projection, that the depth of feeling you experienced was a neurochemical event, rather than an accurate perception of extraordinary value, then you have to grieve something, not just the thing you were chasing, the version of yourself that was chasing it, the narrative in which your desire was evidence of your uniqueness, your sensitivity, your capacity for profound connection. That story is not nothing. It has been sheltering something in you that does not want to be exposed to open air. This is why people fight so hard when their rationalizations are challenged. It doesn't feel like having an intellectual argument about whether someone is a good match or whether an opportunity was truly irreplaceable. It feels like an attack on the self, because the story was never really about the object of desire. The story was about who you needed to be in order to be someone whose desires made sense. Understanding this, not intellectually, but in the uncomfortable, visceral way that actually changes behavior, requires you to be willing to do something that goes against every instinct the rationalization machine was built to prevent. You have to let the story be wrong. Not all of it. Not always. Not always. Sometimes the wanting is accurate, and the story is honest, and the thing you are chasing is genuinely worth what you are spending on it. That happens, but the only way to know the difference, the only way to distinguish real value from constructed value, is to be willing to hold your own narrative at arm's length and ask the question you have been trained by the architecture of your own mind to avoid. What would I think of this if I knew I could have it tomorrow? Because if the answer is less, if the certainty, the urgency, the sense of irreplaceable significance quietly deflates at the mere hypothetical of availability, then you are not experiencing truth. You are experiencing the story the machine told you so, that you would keep running. And somewhere beneath the story, beneath the architecture of justification you built with such care and such craft, the truth has been waiting with extraordinary patience for you to finally come looking for it. Chapter 4. The Reactance Trap. Why no is the most powerful word in psychology. Tell someone they can't have something, and you have just made it the most important thing in the room. You didn't add value to it. You didn't improve it, reveal hidden qualities, or make a compelling case for its worth. You simply drew a line around it. You said, with a word, a gesture, a withdrawal, a locked door, this is not for you, and in that instant, something in the person on the other side of that line ignited. Not gradually, not after reflection, immediately, involuntarily, with a force entirely disproportionate to the actual significance of what was being withheld. This is psychological reactance, and it is not a quirk. It is not a personality trait found in difficult or immature people. It is a fundamental feature of human psychology, so consistent, so universal, so ruthlessly exploitable that it has shaped the architecture of power itself. In governance, in religions, in relationships, in markets, for the entirety of recorded human history. The people who understood it built empires. The people who didn't became subjects of them. And you, right now reading this, have been on the wrong side of this equation far more often than you have been on the right one. Not because you are naive, because the mechanism operates below the threshold of awareness. By the time you realize you want something more because it's been restricted, you are already deep inside the trap, and the walls feel less like a cage than like the contours of your own desire. Let's establish what reactance actually is before we go deeper, because the clinical definition understates its violence. In 1966, psychologist Jack Brame articulated what he observed in human behavior when freedom, real or perceived, was threatened. When people believed that a choice, a behavior, or an object was being taken away from them or made unavailable, they didn't simply accept the loss and recalibrate. They experienced a motivational state, urgent and often irrational, directed entirely at restoring the threatened freedom. Not because the freedom was previously important to them, often because it suddenly, only now, felt essential. The forbidden thing becomes desired specifically and precisely because it is forbidden, not as a side effect, as a direct, mechanical consequence of the restriction itself. Read that again slowly. Because what it means is that the source of your desire and the object of your desire are not always the same thing. Sometimes you are not actually drawn to what you think you are drawn to. You are drawn to the feeling of reclaiming something, the restoration of autonomy, the defiance of a boundary, the primal satisfaction of crossing a line that someone else drew. The thing behind the line is almost incidental. It is the line that is doing the real work. This is where it starts to feel personal, and it should. Think about the specific texture of wanting something you've been told you can't have. Notice how it differs from ordinary desire. When you want something freely available, something easy, something yours for the asking, the desire is present but quiet. It has a kind of calm weight to it. But when a boundary appears, when something is withheld or restricted or suddenly placed behind glass, the desire shifts register entirely. It becomes urgent, agitated. It starts to feel less like preference and more like need. Less like you want this thing and more like you require it. That something essential will be lost if you don't obtain it. That shift in register, that escalation from wanting to needing is reactance, and it is indistinguishable from the inside, from genuine depth of feeling. This is what makes it so devastatingly effective when used deliberately, because it has been used deliberately, consistently, across centuries and cultures and every conceivable domain of human experience, by people who grasped intuitively, strategically, or both. That restriction is the most reliable engine of desire ever identified. Consider prohibition. The American experiment of banning alcohol in the 1920s did not reduce people's relationship with drinking. It transformed alcohol into something mythologized, glamorized, worth risking arrest for. Speakeasies weren't just places to drink. They were temples to the specific pleasure of drinking what you weren't supposed to. The restriction didn't diminish the desire. It gave the desire a kind of sacred quality it had never possessed when alcohol was simply available on any street corner. The same mechanism, operating at the scale of governments and centuries. Now bring it closer. Bring it into the rooms of your own life. The relationship where you were told, explicitly, or through the language of behavior, that you were too much or not quite right, or that the connection existed on someone else's terms and timelines, and you were fortunate to have access to whatever portion was being offered. Remember how that felt. Not the pain of it. You know the pain already, the wanting, the specific quality of craving that came with the uncertainty, the restriction, the sense that full access was always slightly beyond reach. Did the restriction make you want less? Or did it make the wanting feel like the central organizing fact of your life for a period of time? You know the answer. Everyone who has loved something unavailable knows the answer. Restriction doesn't cool desire. It concentrates it, focuses it, strips away every competing interest, and delivers your full attention to the one thing that cannot be easily had. And if someone, consciously or not, is the source of that restriction, They become, in your psychological experience, the person who holds the key to something essential. Not because they are essential, because the architecture of reactance makes them feel that way. They are not the destination, they are the lock. And you are so focused on finding the key that you have stopped questioning whether you actually want to be in that room at all. Here is the darker mechanism within the mechanism, the part that most analyses of reactance politely step around. Reactance doesn't just make you want the restricted thing more, it makes you morally invested in obtaining it. When a freedom is threatened, the brain doesn't just generate desire, it generates justification for that desire. It begins to reframe transgression as righteousness. The person crossing the line starts to feel not like someone breaking a rule, but like someone asserting a fundamental right. This is why forbidden love stories feel epic rather than simply inadvisable. This is why people in controlling relationships often feel, paradoxically, like they are fighting for something noble, even when what they are really fighting for is the right to want without restriction. The emotion of reactance borrows the costume of conviction. This is not weakness, it is not stupidity. It is what the mechanism was designed to produce, because in genuinely restrictive environments, real tyranny, real scarcity, real threats to survival and autonomy, the psychological state that refuses to accept restriction is the state that stays alive. Reactance evolved in service of actual freedom. What it cannot do is distinguish between a genuine threat to liberty and a carefully manufactured scarcity signal, between a border worth crossing and a line drawn specifically because someone knew you would be unable to resist crossing it. And some people, some relationships, some institutions, some marketing teams know exactly what they are doing when they draw that line. They know that no is not the end of your wanting. It is the beginning of something much more useful to them. The question that should be sitting uncomfortably in you right now is not whether this mechanism exists. You've felt it. You know it exists. The question is something more specific and more personal and considerably harder to answer honestly. How many of the things you have pursued most passionately in your life were pursued because they were genuinely valuable? And how many were pursued because a door was closed and something in you could not tolerate that? How many times has someone else's no been the architect of your most intense yes? And the question underneath that one, quieter but more consequential. If the door had been open all along, if there had been no restriction, no line, no sense of forbidden access, would you have wanted it at all? The most powerful thing anyone has ever done to you may not have been something they said or something they took. It may have been something they simply, deliberately withheld and watched you build a cathedral around the wanting. Chapter 5. Playing hard to get is not a game. It's a science. You've been told it's manipulation, immature, a game played by people who are either insecure or cruel or both. You've said it yourself, maybe. I don't play games. With a kind of moral confidence that felt like self-respect but functioned, if you're honest. More like an explanation for why certain approaches to desire kept working on you while you stood there certain of your own sophistication. Here is the uncomfortable revision of everything you think you know about this. Playing hard to get is not a game. It is a documentable, replicable, peer-reviewed psychological phenomenon with measurable neurological outcomes and a success rate that has nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with whether anyone involved is doing it on purpose. That last part is the part that should stop you cold. Because the comfortable story, the one that lets you maintain a clean moral distinction between yourself and the people who play games, requires that intentionality be the operative variable. It requires that the effect only occurs when someone is consciously, deliberately manufacturing unavailability to manipulate another person's desire. If that's true, then you can identify the game, name the player, and remove yourself from the board. But that's not what the research shows. That's not what human psychology actually does. The mechanism operates with complete indifference to intent. Someone can be genuinely busy, genuinely ambivalent, genuinely distracted by the 1,000 other things competing for their attention, and the effect on your desire will be functionally identical to what would happen if they had studied the psychology of attraction for a decade and implemented it with surgical precision. The outcome is the same. the wanting intensifies. The pull becomes more powerful. The person who is simply living their life without centering you becomes, in your psychological experience, more compelling than someone who is fully, consistently, warmly present. This is the part that is genuinely difficult to accept. Not because it's complicated, because of what it implies about every relationship in your life, where you found yourself more drawn to someone who was less available, and every relationship where abundant, steady devotion somehow failed to generate the same quality of longing. Let's be precise about the science, because precision is what this particular truth requires. Researchers studying attraction and mate selection have consistently found what they call the challenge hypothesis, the observation that perceived difficulty of acquisition reliably increases desirability independent of other variables. In studies where participants were presented with potential partners displaying identical qualities but varying levels of expressed interest, the ones who registered moderate uncertainty consistently rated as more attractive than those who indicated immediate, unambiguous enthusiasm. Not dramatically different, not extraordinary by any other measure, just slightly harder to read, slightly less certain as an outcome. That marginal uncertainty was enough. The brain filled the gap with interest. Now, layer onto this what you already understand from the previous chapters: scarcity bias, reactance, the neurochemical cocktail that activates under conditions of uncertain reward. And you start to see that playing hard to get isn't a strategy so much as it is an accidental or deliberate activation of multiple overlapping psychological systems that evolved over millions of years to make uncertain resources feel more worth pursuing than certain ones. The person who is always available, always warm, always clear about their interest, they are offering certainty. And certainty, as your brain processes it, is a closed loop, resolved, filed. The dopaminergic reward system, which runs on anticipation and uncertainty, has very little use for a closed loop. It is not designed to sustain intense engagement with things that are already secured. It is designed to drive pursuit of things that are not. This is not a criticism of consistency or warmth or emotional availability. Those things are genuinely valuable in ways the reward system is not equipped to measure. The reward system is ancient and it is stupid, and it does not care about your long-term well-being. It cares about the chase, and it will generate the subjective experience of profound connection, the racing pulse, the preoccupied mind, the sense that this particular person has some quality you cannot afford to miss, in response to uncertainty, regardless of whether the uncertainty reflects anything real about the person's depth or value. Feel the full weight of that. The feeling of connection you associate with falling for someone may be, in significant part, a response to their unavailability rather than their actual qualities, which means you may have spent years confusing the chase with the connection. Here is where it becomes specifically, uncomfortably personal. Think about someone who is consistently, reliably available to you. Someone who made their interest clear, who responded promptly, who showed up without requiring extensive pursuit, who offered warmth without making you earn it. And notice, honestly, without self-flattery, what your desire looked like in that context. Whether it had the same quality of intensity. Whether you found yourself as preoccupied, as invested, as viscerally engaged as you were with someone who made you work for every moment of access. If the answer is no, and for most people reading this with genuine honesty, the answer is no, then you have just identified something important about the gap between what you rationally know you should want and what your psychological architecture actually responds to. The reliable person felt like a given. The uncertain person felt like a mystery. And the brain always will allocate more resources to the mystery. Now here is the layer underneath that one, darker and more structurally significant. Once you understand this mechanism, once you see it clearly, you face a choice that most people never fully articulate to themselves. Because the science works in both directions. Understanding why perceived challenge amplifies desire means understanding that you can, if you choose, be more intentional about your own availability, not as manipulation, as self-possession. As the natural byproduct of having a full life, genuine standards, and an identity that doesn't contract around other people's level of interest. The problem is that this understanding is easily corrupted. There is a version of this knowledge that produces authentic confidence. A person who is genuinely engaged in their own life, who has real boundaries, who doesn't perform interest they don't feel, and doesn't perform absence to manufacture interest in others. And there is a version that produces something colder. A person who has weaponized the science, who manufactures unavailability as a calculated tactic, who has learned to treat other people's psychological vulnerabilities as leverage. The science cannot make that distinction for you. The mechanism doesn't have ethics. It simply works, on the person deploying it and on the person experiencing it, with the same ruthless consistency regardless of the moral character of anyone involved. What separates the two versions is not the behavior. Sometimes the behavior looks identical from the outside. What separates them is what's underneath it. Whether the unavailability is real, a reflection of genuine self-possession, genuine standards, genuine fullness of life, or perform. Whether you are someone who has a lot going on, or someone who has learned to pretend they do in order to produce a specific response in someone else. The first is attractive because it is true. The second is effective because the mechanism doesn't check for truth. And this is where the science becomes genuinely dangerous. Not because knowing it makes you a manipulator, because knowing it makes it harder to tell the difference in others. And eventually, if you're not careful in yourself, you will meet people who have internalized this knowledge and wear it like a second skin, who have practiced optimal unavailability for so long that it no longer feels like practice, whose distance feels like depth, whose silences feel like mystery, whose intermittent warmth feels like a window into something rare and worth earning. And your brain, running the same ancient software it has always run, pulling toward the uncertain, inflating the value of the scarce, will respond exactly as it was designed to. Knowing the name of the trap does not automatically lift your foot out of it. It just means you watch it close around you with something slightly closer to clarity. And clarity, as you are beginning to discover, is not the same thing as freedom. But it is, perhaps, the only place freedom ever starts. Chapter 6. Intermittent Reinforcement. The slot machine you're already inside. You are not weak. You are not broken. You are not someone who lacks self-respect or intelligence, or the capacity to recognize what is good for you. You are addicted, and the thing you are addicted to was specifically, almost perfectly designed, by accident or by instinct, to make leaving feel neurologically identical to self-destruction. This is not a metaphor. This is not therapeutic language deployed to make you feel better about a pattern. You should simply stop. This is a precise clinical description of what unpredictable reward does to the human brain, and why the most painful attachments in your life have been, in measurable biochemical terms, indistinguishable from substance dependence. The slot machine doesn't look like a relationship. That's why you never saw it. But walk through the mechanics with me slowly, and tell me when it stops feeling familiar. B.F. Skinner, behavioral psychologist, mid-20th century. A man whose work you were probably never taught in a way that made it feel personally relevant. Ran a series of experiments that produced one of the most consequential and least socially discussed findings in the history of human psychology. He was studying reward schedules. The question was simple. Which pattern of reward produces the most persistent behavior? If you want an animal or a person to keep doing something, what is the most effective way to deploy positive reinforcement? The answer was not what most people would guess. Constant reward. Receiving something good every single time you perform a behavior produces steady, reliable behavior that stops almost immediately when the reward is removed. The brain learns the pattern, calibrates to it, and when it ends, it registers the end clearly and updates accordingly. Predictable reward trains predictable behavior with a predictable off switch. But unpredictable reward, sometimes yes, sometimes no. No discernible pattern, no way to know when the next positive response will come, produces something categorically different. It produces behavior that is compulsive, persistent, and extraordinarily resistant to extinction. The animal keeps pressing the lever long after any rational calculation would suggest the reward is gone. But behavior escalates rather than diminishing. And the neurological state that drives it is not contentment or satisfaction. It is a specific, agitated, dopamine-saturated state of urgent anticipation that is, in its biochemistry, nearly identical to craving. Skinner called this variable ratio reinforcement. Casino designers call it the business model. And somewhere in your history, in at least one relationship that you stayed in far longer than made sense, someone was a slot machine they didn't mean to be. Probably the hot and cold, the warmth followed by distance, the moments of profound connection scattered unpredictably among stretches of absence or coldness or emotional unavailability. Most of the time, this isn't strategy. It is simply the natural output of someone who is inconsistent, ambivalent, emotionally dysregulated, or simply living a life in which you are not always a priority. The effect is the same. Intent is irrelevant to the mechanism. The variable ratio schedule doesn't care about anyone's motivations. It cares only about unpredictability. And unpredictability, delivered in the context of something you already want, will reliably produce in you the neurological profile of someone who cannot walk away from a lever that might, this time, finally pay out. Now locate the specific relationship, or situationship, or dynamic where you most clearly recognize this pattern. Not the easy one, the real one. Remember the texture of waiting for a message, not a casual wait. The specific, charged, attention-saturated wait that felt like your nervous system was running at a frequency higher than normal, that made every phone notification a small cardiovascular event. Remember the particular quality of relief when the warmth returned after a period of cold, how disproportionately good it felt, how the return of something that should have been baseline felt instead like something won, something rare, something worth the cost of the silence that preceded it. That relief, that specific flooding relief, that was not love, though it felt like it. That was not connection, though it arrived wearing connection's face. That was your brain finally receiving the unpredictable reward it had been in agitated pursuit of. The lever paid out, and in the neurochemical cascade that followed. Dopamine flooding the reward pathways, cortisol briefly receding, the whole system sighing into temporary resolution. What you felt was not the warmth of genuine intimacy. It was the satisfaction of a craving temporarily met. This is why the good moments in certain relationships feel so disproportionately good. They are not better moments than you would experience in a stable, consistent connection. In many cases, they are objectively less tender, less attentive, less genuinely intimate, but they arrive after deprivation. And anything experienced after deprivation is neurologically amplified. The brain doesn't just respond to the reward, it responds to the contrast. The relief of rain after drought is not about the quality of the water. And this is the mechanism that keeps people in relationships that are costing them more than they are receiving. Not stupidity, not low self-worth, though that can be a contributing factor. The pure biological, measurable pull of a variable reward schedule that has trained their nervous system to associate this specific person with the most potent neurochemical experience available to them. Not because the person is extraordinary, but because the unpredictability of their warmth has made each instance of it feel like something that has to be earned, waited for, and desperately not missed when it arrives. You can see this same mechanism operating everywhere once you know what to look for. And this is where the discomfort of this chapter expands beyond personal relationships into something more structurally troubling. Social media platforms are not accidentally addictive. The variable reward schedule embedded in them. Will this post get engagement or won't it? Will there be new notifications or won't there? Will the scroll produce something interesting or won't it? Was not a byproduct of poor design. It was, in several documented cases, an intentional design decision informed by precisely this research. The architects of these platforms knew what Skinner had found. They built the lever, They made the ratio variable, and then they put it in your pocket and suggested you check it throughout the day. You are not someone who lacks discipline. You are someone who has been handed a slot machine engineered by people with PhDs in behavioral psychology and the resources to optimize it continuously based on your behavior in real time. The fact that you find it difficult to put down is not a character flaw. It is a testimony to how well the machine was built. But here is what sits at the center of all of this, the darkest and most important thing this chapter has to offer. The slot machine becomes most powerful, not despite the losses, but because of them. This is the finding that most people, when they encounter it, have to sit with for a long time before it fully lands. In a variable reward schedule, it is not the wins that sustain the behavior, it is the near misses. The moments that felt like they were almost the thing you needed, that came close enough to keep the system running, without delivering enough to close the loop and allow the craving to resolve. The almost warmth, the almost commitment, the conversation that felt like it was finally going somewhere real and then didn't, the gesture that suggested something genuine might be available if you just stayed a little longer, invested a little more, tolerated a little more inconsistency. Every almost is a lever pull that didn't pay out. And after every unpaid lever pull, the urge to pull again intensifies rather than diminishing. You were not weak for staying. You were inside a system specifically calibrated by accident or design to make staying feel like the only rational option. The brain running on variable reinforcement does not experience the choice to walk away as liberation. It experiences it as abandonment of the lever right before the payout. And the payout, the brain insists, is always just one more pull away. The cruelest thing about the slot machine is not that it takes your money. It's that it makes you believe, with complete sincerity, that the next pull is the one that finally makes everything make sense. Chapter 7. Your attachment style is a vulnerability profile. Everything that has come before this chapter was about the system, the wiring, the evolutionary machinery, the neurochemistry, the behavioral loops that operate on everyone with roughly equal indifference. Those chapters were about the mechanism. This chapter is about you specifically, because here is what the previous 6 chapters have been quietly building toward. The thing that sits underneath all the science and the research, and the carefully documented psychological phenomena. The mechanism doesn't affect everyone identically. It has a general architecture, yes, but the way it expresses itself in your particular life, the specific types of unavailability that pull you hardest, the precise quality of the wanting that most destabilizes you, that was custom built, constructed across years, assembled from the earliest and most formative experiences you had with the people who were supposed to be reliably there. Your attachment style is not a personality type. It is a survival strategy. One you developed before you had language for it, before you had any conscious participation in the process. In response to the most pressing question a very young human brain faces, can I depend on the people I need? Depending on the answer your environment gave you, consistently, repeatedly, through action and absence in pattern rather than intention, your nervous system wrote a program, a specific personalized set of rules about how relationships work, how much closeness is safe, how to interpret withdrawal, what availability means, what distance means, and most critically, what kind of behavior from another person triggers your deepest and most consuming desire. And that program has been running ever since, quietly, continuously, in the background of every relationship you have ever had, shaping your responses before your conscious mind has finished registering the situation. You did not choose it. You cannot simply decide to override it. And until you see it clearly, fully, without the softening that self-protection requires, it will continue to operate as the hidden architecture of your wanting. Let's go to the specific profiles. Not as categories to neatly sort yourself into. Human psychology is too complex for clean taxonomy, but as mirrors. Hold each one up and notice where your own reflection appears. The person with anxious attachment learned early that love was inconsistent, that the people they needed were sometimes present and sometimes not, sometimes warm and sometimes cold. and that the pattern was not predictable enough to fully trust. The nervous system, trying to solve an unsolvable problem, developed a specific response to this unpredictability: hypervigilance. Constant monitoring of the emotional temperature of the room, an exquisite sensitivity to the slightest shift in another person's availability or effect, and a craving, deep, structural, never quite satisfied, for reassurance that the connection is still there. This person does not struggle with the unavailable because they are weak. They struggle because their nervous system learned to run on the specific frequency of uncertain availability. It became, in the most literal sense, the familiar. And the familiar, no matter how painful, registers to the ancient parts of the brain as safe. Because it is known, because it has been survived before, because the alternative, something genuinely stable and consistent, feels not like relief but like a frequency the nervous system doesn't quite know how to tune into. The person with avoidant attachment learned something different. They learned that needing people was costly, that expressing dependency or vulnerability produced not warmth but distance or discomfort in the people they needed most. So the nervous system did what nervous systems do under threat. It adapted. It built walls that looked like self-sufficiency. It learned to downregulate attachment needs, not to eliminate them, because they cannot be eliminated, they are biological, but to suppress the conscious awareness of them until they became almost invisible. This person does not struggle with intimacy because they don't want it. They struggle because somewhere in their history, wanting it cost them something they couldn't afford. And so they move through relationships at a specific distance, close enough to maintain connection, far enough to maintain the illusion of safety. And they are, without entirely meaning to be, exactly the kind of intermittently available presence that activates the deepest craving in an anxiously attached person. Notice that, sit with what that means. These two profiles find each other with a consistency that is not coincidental. The anxious person's pursuit triggers the avoidant person's withdrawal, which intensifies the anxious person's pursuit, which deepens the avoidant person's sense of being overwhelmed, which produces more withdrawal, which produces more pursuit. A closed loop. A system running itself into the ground, while both people inside it experience the most intense emotional engagement of their lives and call it love, and wonder why it hurts so much, and conclude that the intensity is proof of the connection's depth rather than evidence of the wound being touched. The intensity is not proof of depth. Sometimes, often, it is proof of fit. The fit between an old injury and the specific kind of interaction that reopens it. This is the part that is hardest to hold without flinching. The people who have had the most disproportionate power over you. The ones whose approval felt like oxygen, whose withdrawal felt like the floor disappearing, whose intermittent warmth felt like grace. They were not necessarily extraordinary. They were, in some deep, structural way, familiar. They were replicating a pattern your nervous system already knew. And because the nervous system orients toward the familiar with the same instinctive pull, it orients toward the safe, you experienced their particular brand of unavailability, not as a warning, but as a recognition. Something in you said, I know this. I know how to move in this space. I know what it costs, and I know what the reward feels like, and I know how to wait for it. And that knowing, that terrible, intimate, structural knowing, is what made them feel like home. Here is the darkest layer of this. The one that makes the attachment framework something more than an interesting psychological model. Your attachment profile is readable, not to trained therapists only, to people with a certain kind of intuitive intelligence about human behavior, people who have learned by experience or by instinct to recognize the signals that indicate how someone responds to availability and withdrawal. The anxious person's hypervigilance, their sensitivity to distance, their tendency to work harder for connection when it feels threatened. These are legible. The avoidant person's retreat when things get too close, their sudden coolness after warmth, their need for space that arrives precisely when intimacy deepens, also legible. And illegible means accessible. It means that someone who understands, consciously or intuitively, how your attachment system works possesses a kind of map. They know, not necessarily in words but in practice, which lever to pull and when, how much warmth to offer before pulling back, how long to be distant before returning with just enough presence to reset the cycle. They don't need to have studied psychology. They just need to have learned, through years of their own relational history, what works. This is not an accusation aimed at everyone who has ever been inconsistent with you. Most people are not strategic architects of your emotional experience. They are simply people with their own attachment wounds, running their own programs, producing their own patterns, which happen to interface with yours in ways that neither of you fully chose or fully understand. But some people do know. Some people have developed, through instinct or through practice, an understanding of how inconsistency operates on the attached nervous system. And they use it, not always with malice. Sometimes with the casual, almost unconscious expertise of someone who has learned that pulling back produces pursuit, that warmth after distance produces disproportionate gratitude, that being just unavailable enough keeps the other person oriented toward them in a way that consistent presence never would. The knowledge that your attachment style is a vulnerability profile does not mean you are permanently exposed. It means you are currently exposed and unaware, which is the most dangerous version. Awareness doesn't eliminate the pattern, but it does something that might ultimately be more useful. It lets you see the map from the outside, to hold it up, recognize its contours, and begin, slowly, imperfectly, with frequent returns to the old grooves, to understand that the familiar is not the same as the true. That the person who feels like home might be feeling that way because they are replicating a place you needed to leave. That the intensity of what they activate in you is not always evidence of their value. Sometimes it is simply evidence of how long the wound has been there. And the wound, unlike the people who have touched it, is yours. Which means it is also, perhaps for the first time, something you actually have the power to change. Chapter 8. The Mirror Dynamic. What you chase reflects what you believe you deserve. The person you cannot stop chasing is not telling you something about their value. They are telling you something about yours, or rather, about what you believe yours to be. Deep down, in the place where self-concept lives before it gets dressed in the clothes of confidence and self-awareness, and all the language of personal growth you've accumulated along the way. Not the version of yourself you present, the version that makes the decisions. The one that chooses, again and again, with remarkable consistency, the person who makes you work for it. That version of you has been trying to tell you something for a very long time. You haven't been listening, because listening would require sitting with something that is genuinely difficult to look at directly. The possibility that the pattern is not bad luck, not poor judgment, not a failure to meet the right people at the right time. The possibility that the pattern is a reflection, that what you pursue obsessively and repeatedly is a near-perfect external expression of what you believe. At the level below conscious thought, you are worth receiving, not what you know you deserve, what you feel you deserve. Those two things are not the same. And the gap between them is where most of the damage happens. Let's establish something precisely, because this chapter will be misread if we don't. This is not an argument that you consciously seek out pain. It is not a claim that you want to suffer, or that you are drawn to unavailability because some dark part of you enjoys the feeling of pursuit and rejection. The mechanism is both simpler and more structurally embedded than that. It operates not through desire for pain, but through the profound organism-level comfort of the familiar, and through a specific equation, written in your earliest relational experiences, about what love actually looks and feels like in practice. If the love you learned first, the love that was present during the period when your nervous system was most plastic, most impressionable, most desperately building its model of how human connection works. If that love was conditional, inconsistent, something that had to be earned through performance or endurance or waiting, then your nervous system did not file this under painful. It filed it under love. It filed it under this is what caring about someone feels like. This is what it means when it's real. And every subsequent relationship has been, in some part, tested against that template. Not consciously, not deliberate, but with the quiet, relentless pattern matching of a brain that learned very early what love's texture was supposed to be, and that registers consistent, freely given devotion not as the thing you've been looking for, but as something slightly off, something that doesn't quite feel like the real thing, because it doesn't feel like the thing you learned was the real thing. This is the mirror dynamic. What you chase is not random. It is calibrated. Your choices in who to pursue, who to stay with past the point of reason, who to exhaust yourself trying to win. These choices are not accidents or failures of judgment. They are, in their own distorted way, deeply coherent. They reflect a self-concept operating below your awareness, a quiet and persistent belief about the level of consistency, warmth, and devotion you are structurally permitted to receive without something feeling wrong. Not the story you tell about it, the actual pattern. Look at the people you have pursued most intensely. The ones who occupied your mind, dominated your emotional landscape, made you into someone you didn't entirely recognize. Were they, as a group, reliably available? Were they consistent? Did they offer the kind of steady, uncomplicated presence that asks nothing exceptional of you in return? Or did they, with remarkable consistency across different faces and different names and different contexts, share a specific quality? The sense that your place with them was never entirely secure, that their love or interest or approval was something you had to continuously demonstrate your worthiness of receiving. And now look at the other side. The people who offered you exactly what you claimed to want: consistency, warmth, clear, and uncomplicated devotion. What happened to your desire in those relationships? Did it deepen with time? Did the reliability feel like safety? Or did something subtler occur? A quiet deflation, a sense that something was missing, a creeping feeling that this person, as genuinely kind as they were, somehow wasn't quite right, wasn't quite enough, wasn't quite what you were looking for, though you couldn't entirely explain what you were looking for that this person wasn't providing. That deflation, that sense of something missing in the presence of exactly what you said you wanted, that is the mirror speaking. That is the self-concept asserting itself. And what it is asserting is something that, stated plainly, sounds too bleak to be true, but is supported by decades of psychological research on self-worth and relational patterning. Easily given love feels wrong, because somewhere beneath everything, you believe that love you didn't have to earn isn't real. Or, in the version that cuts even deeper, you don't fully believe you deserve it. And so when it arrives without conditions, without effort, without the familiar weight of uncertainty and pursuit, it registers as a mistake, as something this person would correct if they knew you better, and so you leave. Or you stay but remain emotionally absent. Or you find, almost without trying, ways to create distance, ways to introduce uncertainty into something that was stable, to generate the tension that your nervous system reads as the authentic texture of connection. You recreate the conditions of your earliest relational template, not because you want to suffer, but because suffering, in this specific configuration, is what your system learned to recognize as love's proof. The cruelest expression of this pattern is what happens when you finally win the unavailable person. When the pursuit ends and the person who made you work so hard finally turns, fully toward you. When the uncertainty resolves into something that looks, from the outside, like exactly what you were fighting for. Watch what happens to the desire. In many cases, not all, but enough to constitute a pattern that researchers have documented with quiet frequency. It evaporates. Not gradually. Often suddenly, with a speed that is disorienting. The person who occupied your entire inner landscape for months becomes, in the aftermath of their full availability, someone you struggle to remain interested in. The love story that felt epic in pursuit becomes, in attainment, strangely ordinary. And you find yourself looking, almost involuntarily, toward the next horizon, the next closed door, the next person who carries in their unavailability the specific frequency of challenge that makes your wanting feel alive. This is not fickleness. This is not a fear of commitment, though it can masquerade as one. This is the self-concept doing exactly what it was built to do. Rejecting as somehow illegitimate the love that doesn't require you to prove yourself worthy of it. Because if you receive love without proof, if devotion arrives unconditionally, without the test, then you are left with a question your self-concept is not yet equipped to answer. What if I am actually worth this? That question is more destabilizing than it sounds. Because accepting it, truly accepting it, not just performing acceptance of it in therapy or self-help language, requires dismantling the foundational architecture of a belief system that has been organizing your entire relational life. It requires grieving the version of yourself that had to earn everything. It requires holding the possibility that the template you built your wanting on was always a response to deprivation, not a definition of depth. And most people, when they arrive at that threshold, find it easier to go looking for another closed door than to walk through the one that's already open. The mirror doesn't lie. It shows you with extraordinary precision not who you are, but who you have been convinced by years and circumstances and people who were themselves limited that you are allowed to be. And the first step towards something different is not finding someone better to chase. It is becoming someone who no longer needs the chase to feel real. Chapter 9. The Ethical Knife. Using these principles without losing yourself. You have been reading this book from one of two positions. Either you have been the person these mechanisms were used on, recognizing, with growing discomfort, the architecture of your own wanting and the external forces that shaped it. Or you have been at some point the person using them, consciously or not, skillfully or clumsily, with genuine self-possession or with the hollow performance of it. Most people, if they are honest, have been both, and now you are here, in possession of a map that most people never see clearly. You understand how scarcity inflates value. You understand reactance, intermittent reinforcement, the attachment vulnerabilities that make certain people exquisitely responsive to specific patterns of availability and withdrawal. You have seen the machinery from the inside and from the outside, and the knowledge sits in you now with a particular weight that knowledge of this kind always carries. The weight of choice. Because here is the question this chapter refuses to step around. The one that has been building since the first page, and that comfortable books about human psychology tend to answer too quickly, too cleanly, in ways that let the reader feel resolved when they should feel implicated. Now that you know, what are you going to do with it? This is not a rhetorical question. It is the most consequential question in the book, because the principles documented in the preceding chapters are not theoretical. They are operational. They work in the real world, on real people, with measurable and often dramatic effect. And knowing how they work does not make you immune to deploying them. In fact, for a certain kind of person, in a certain psychological state, the knowledge of how these tools operate makes the temptation to use them more acute, not less. Let's be precise about what using them actually means. Because there is a version of this that is not only acceptable, but represents genuine psychological health, and there is a version that is something considerably darker, and the line between them is not always as visible as people who are on the wrong side of it tend to believe. Authentic self-possession, a genuinely full life, real standards, the natural unavailability of someone who is deeply engaged with their own existence, who doesn't perform interest they don't feel, who doesn't contract their identity around another person's level of engagement, who has learned through actual interior work to be comfortable with their own company in a way that reads to others as a kind of magnetic independence. This is not a strategy. This cannot be faked for long. And when it is real, when it is the genuine expression of someone who has done the difficult work of becoming a complete person, rather than one who depends on external validation for structural integrity, it is, in fact, attractive. Powerfully, durably, authentically attractive. That is the ethical use of everything in this book, not the manufacture of these qualities, the actual development of them. And then there is the other version, the person who has read the same research, absorbed the same principles, and made a different decision, not to become someone with genuine depth and self-possession, but to perform the external markers of those qualities, with sufficient skill that the neurochemical response they produce in others is indistinguishable from the real thing, the manufactured withdrawal. The calculated warmth deployed with precise timing after periods of deliberate absence. The constructed mystery, not the mystery of a complex person whose inner world takes time to reveal, but the engineered opacity of someone who has learned that being unreadable produces pursuit. From the outside, in the early stages, these two versions can look identical. The person of genuine self-possession and the person performing it can produce similar effects in the people around them. The neurochemistry doesn't check for authenticity. The mechanism doesn't verify source. But divergence happens, it always happens. Because the manufactured version requires maintenance in a way the authentic version does not. It requires continuous management of information, of availability, of the impression being created. It requires holding a gap between who you are presenting yourself to be and who you actually are, and maintaining that gap across time and increasing intimacy, and the thousand small moments where a real relationship demands that you show up as yourself, rather than as the optimized performance of yourself. And gaps of that kind are expensive. They cost something that doesn't appear on the balance sheet immediately, but accumulates with interest. They cost you your own interiority. Here is what happens to people who operate primarily through manufactured influence over long periods of time. Not as a moral judgment, but as a psychological observation documented in the research on what practitioners of chronic manipulation actually experience over time. The performance, repeated often enough, begins to replace the thing it was performing. The distance you manufactured becomes the only distance you know how to maintain. The opacity you deployed strategically becomes the only mode of self-presentation available to you. The withholding, initially calculated, becomes structural. Because you have practiced it so thoroughly that genuine openness now feels not like vulnerability, but like loss of control. You set out to create desire in others. You ended up creating a kind of internal isolation that no amount of external validation can reach. Power without integrity doesn't liberate. That phrase is not moralizing. It is a description of a specific psychological outcome that follows, with considerable consistency, from the long-term use of influence tools in the absence of genuine self-examination. The person who learns to move people like pieces without ever developing the interior depth that would make those movements mean something, that person does not end up powerful. They end up alone in a way that is particularly difficult to diagnose, because it is surrounded by people who are drawn to them, and the desire they generate in others. Real desire, neurochemically genuine, produced by the reliable activation of ancient psychological mechanisms, never reaches them, because between the desire and the self there is the performance, and the performance is, by design, impenetrable. Now come back to you, to the specific, honest question of where you are in this. Because very few people who pick up a book like this are entirely innocent of deploying these principles. And very few are entirely cynical about them either. Most people exist in the complicated middle, sometimes genuinely self-possessed, sometimes performing it, sometimes uncertain which one they're doing, sometimes using a painful experience of being manipulated as justification for learning to do it to others, in relationships or in professional contexts or in the casual daily theater of social presentation. The question worth sitting with is not whether you have ever pulled these levers. Almost everyone has. The question is whether the version of yourself you are building, through the choices you make about how to show up, how to be available, how to deploy the knowledge you now carry, is a version you would respect. Whether the desire you generate in others is connected to something real in you, or whether it floats increasingly untethered, above an interior life you have stopped investing in because the performance has become more rewarding in the short term than the work. There is no external enforcement mechanism for this distinction. No one can see clearly enough into your motivations to hold you accountable. The only judge with full access to the evidence is the one you have to live inside. And that judge, quieter than the wanting, less urgent than the mechanism, often drowned out by the noise of pursuit and strategy and the short-term satisfaction of influence, has been paying attention to everything. The knife that understands its own sharpness is not less dangerous. But it is at least in hands that know what cutting costs and can choose with open eyes whether the wound it makes is one worth making. Chapter 10. Disenchantment. What happens when the spell breaks? You got it. Finally, after everything. After the waiting and the wanting and the sleepless reconstruction of every interaction. After the months of interpreting signals and misreading silences and building, brick by careful brick, an entire architecture of meaning around something that kept receding just fast enough to stay out of reach. You got it. The person. The position. The life you had decided with complete conviction was the one you were supposed to have. And then something happened that no one warned you about. Something that the pursuit, in all its consuming intensity, had given you no preparation for whatsoever. It got ordinary. Not immediately, perhaps. There may have been a brief period, hours, days, sometimes a few weeks, where the attainment felt like the vindication it was supposed to be. Where you could look at what you now possessed and feel the satisfaction of a closed loop, a solved equation, a hunger finally met. But underneath that satisfaction, moving slowly at first and then with gathering speed, came something else, something quieter and more corrosive than disappointment. A deflation. The thing you had made the center of your wanting, the thing you had assigned extraordinary significance to, had sacrificed for, had reorganized your inner life around, revealed itself in the light of actual possession to be approximately what it was, not terrible. Often genuinely good, but not what the chase had made it feel like. Not the luminous, irreplaceable, once-in-a-lifetime thing that months of pursuit had constructed in your imagination. Just a thing, a person, a job, a life, real and three-dimensional and available now, which meant by the logic of everything you've learned in this book, that it no longer activated the system that had made it feel extraordinary. The spell broke, and in the silence after it broke, you were left with a question you didn't entirely want to answer. Was it ever real? This is post-attainment disillusionment. It is one of the least discussed and most universally experienced phenomena in human psychology. Least discussed, perhaps, because acknowledging it requires admitting something about the nature of desire that most people find genuinely destabilizing. It requires sitting with the possibility that the intensity of wanting was not a response to the thing itself. That what felt like recognition of something rare was actually the mechanism running, the scarcity bias, the dopaminergic chase state, the neurological intoxication of uncertain reward. And that without the uncertainty, without the pursuit, without the specific conditions that made the wanting feel so urgent and so meaningful. The thing you were chasing was always just a thing. Not nothing, but not what you made it. The disillusionment arrives in different forms depending on what was pursued. In relationships, it can look like the sudden, disorienting discovery that the person you couldn't stop thinking about is, in fact, a human being. With mundane habits and ordinary flaws, and a kind of consistent, predictable presence that the chase had never prepared you to find appealing. The mystery that made them compelling during pursuit becomes inavailability, just the ordinary opacity of another person's inner life. The distance that made every moment of closeness feel earned and precious becomes, when it disappears, simply its absence. And absence, it turns out, was doing more work than the person was. In careers, it arrives as the specific flatness that follows years of striving toward a position or achievement that was supposed to change something essential about how you felt about yourself, and then didn't. The office, the title, the recognition, real, legitimate, genuinely worked for. And yet the morning after it arrives, something in you is already scanning the horizon for the next closed door, already beginning the process of inflating the next uncertain thing into the shape of the answer. Because the wanting doesn't stop, it redirects. This is the mechanism's most elegant and most exhausting feature. It is self-renewing. The chase state, the neurological profile of active pursuit toward an uncertain reward, is not designed to terminate at attainment. It is designed to find a new target. The dopaminergic system that made the unavailable thing feel precious does not satisfy itself when the thing becomes available. It recalibrates, It identifies the next source of uncertainty. It begins with the same urgency and the same chemical authority to make that new thing feel like the one you've actually been looking for all along. And so the person who just won the impossible relationship starts quietly to notice other people. The executive who just reached the summit starts, almost involuntarily, to assess the next mountain. The life that was supposed to be the destination reveals itself as a waypoint. Not because it isn't good, but because the system was never oriented toward destinations. It was oriented toward the journey, toward the specific neurological state of not yet having. Attainment is not the point. The pursuit is the point, and the mechanism will generate new pursuits with the same reliability it generated this one for the rest of your life, unless something fundamentally changes in your relationship to wanting itself. Here is the deeper and more troubling layer of disenchantment, the one that sits beneath the obvious disappointment of getting what you wanted and finding it insufficient. In the vacuum left by the spell's breaking, after the inflated meaning has drained away and you are standing in front of the real and ordinary version of what you chased, there is a grief that doesn't announce itself clearly. Not grief for the thing, for the wanting, for the state of pursuit that, for all its agitation and anxiety and cost, had a specific texture of aliveness that the attainment does not. People don't often admit this. It sounds perverse, grieving the loss of suffering, mourning the end of a chase that was consuming. But the chase, for all its pain, had structure. It organized the day. It populated the mind. It generated a sense of stakes, of significance, of a story in which you were the protagonist, moving towards something that mattered. And in its absence, in the ordinary, stable, available aftermath, there is sometimes a flatness that feels worse than the pursuit felt, even at its most desperate. This is why some people unconsciously sabotage attainment. Why the relationship that finally becomes secure suddenly seems to generate problems that weren't visible during pursuit. Why the career that was supposed to be enough becomes, within months of reaching it, insufficient. Why the human capacity for happiness seems so stubbornly resistant to staying in one place. Because happiness, in the vocabulary of the mechanism, is not a destination. It is a direction, and a direction requires something to move toward. The chase, understood this way, is not really about the object. It never was. The object was always a vehicle, a way of generating the specific internal state that pursuit produces. The person or the prize at the end was almost incidental, a placeholder for a feeling that was never really about them at all, which means that every time you have been consumed by wanting something you couldn't have, the central experience, the urgency, the significance, the sense of being fully alive and oriented towards something that mattered, was being generated entirely within you. The external thing was the occasion. The experience was yours, and this realization, uncomfortable as it is, points towards something important. If the intensity was always internal, if the feeling of profound wanting was always a product of your own psychology rather than an accurate reflection of the object's value, then the question is not how to find something worthy of that intensity. The question is what you are actually looking for when you chase. What need the pursuit is meeting that the attainment never can. What the spell was protecting you from having to face in the silence it was filling. Because the spell always breaks. Every time, without exception, the spell breaks. And what is left in the wreckage of every disenchantment, quiet, patient, waiting to be seen clearly, is not the disappointing thing you obtained. It is the self that was doing the wanting. And that self has been trying, through every chase and every deflation, to tell you something you have not yet been still enough to hear. Chapter 11. Reprogramming the Want. How to desire what's actually good for you. You cannot think your way out of a feeling that you behaved your way into. Read that again, because the most common mistake people make when they arrive at this stage, when they have seen the mechanism, named the pattern, trace the wound back to its origin, is believing that understanding is the same as change. That insight is transformation. That the map is the territory. It isn't. And the gap between knowing and being different is where most self-improvement quietly dies. You have spent 10 chapters acquiring a specific kind of clarity. You understand, now, more about the architecture of your own desire than most people will accumulate in a lifetime of experience. You can see the scarcity bias operating. You can feel the reactance response activate. You can recognize, at least in calmer moments with adequate distance, when the intensity of your wanting is disproportionate to the actual value of what you're chasing, when you are running the old program rather than responding to genuine, present tense reality. And yet, the pull still comes, doesn't it? Even now, even with everything you know, the unavailable thing still has a specific gravity that the available thing doesn't. The person who is slightly uncertain still produces more neurological engagement than the person who is clear. The closed door still draws your attention more reliably than the open one, even when you can name, precisely and accurately, exactly why that is. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is not evidence that the preceding chapters were useless or that self-knowledge is a dead end. It is simply the reality of how deeply embodied these patterns are. How much they live in the body, in the nervous system, in the implicit memory structures that operate below the threshold of conscious thought, and do not update simply because the conscious mind has acquired new information. Reprogramming the want is not an intellectual project. It is a somatic one, a behavioral one, a slow, repetitive, often unglamorous process of building new relational experiences that gradually, not suddenly, not as a result of a single insight, but gradually across time, begin to update the implicit template your nervous system is running on. Let's be honest about what that actually requires, because most treatments of this subject make it sound cleaner than it is. The first thing it requires is tolerating the flatness. When you begin orienting toward people and situations that offer genuine consistency, genuine warmth, genuine availability, your nervous system will not immediately respond with the intensity it generates for the unavailable. It will feel, particularly at first, like something is missing, like the frequency is wrong, like the connection, however genuinely good it might be by every rational measure, lacks the charge you associate with real feeling. This flatness is not a signal that you've chosen wrong. It is withdrawal. It is your reward system recalibrating from a high stimulation input, the unpredictable, the scarce, the hard to get, toward a lower stimulation input that is paradoxically actually more nourishing. The nervous system has been running on the neurochemical equivalent of a high-sugar diet. Whole foods don't hit the same way at first. That's not because they're worse. That's because your palate has been distorted. The flatness is the beginning of repair, not evidence of the wrong direction. The second thing it requires is a new relationship to the feeling of wanting itself, a willingness to examine desire at the moment of its arising, rather than simply following its momentum. Not to suppress it, not to talk yourself out of it through logic or self-criticism, but to pause in the actual moment and ask one question with genuine curiosity rather than defensive self-interrogation. What is this wanting made of? Is it made of genuine appreciation for something you have spent real time with, assessed with some degree of clarity, and found valuable in ways that have nothing to do with its scarcity or unavailability? Or is it made of the mechanism, the neurochemical urgency that gets attached to whatever is uncertain, whatever is pulling away, whatever your reactance response has identified as a threatened freedom? You will not always be able to tell the difference immediately. The mechanism is too fluent in the language of genuine feeling for clean distinction to come easily. But the practice of asking the question, of inserting even a brief pause between the desire and the pursuit, long enough to feel what the wanting is actually composed of, begins over time to create something that didn't previously exist. Space, interior space between stimulus and response, in which something other than the automatic program can operate. This is not control in the sense of suppression. It is not the grim, white-knuckled discipline of someone forcing themselves away from what they want through sheer willpower. A strategy that fails reliably and expensively, because what you resist persists, because prohibition is itself a scarcity signal, because you have spent enough chapters in this book to know that telling yourself you cannot have something is one of the most reliable methods of intensifying your desire for it. This is something subtler. the development of a kind of internal observer. Not a judge, not a critic, not the internalized voice of self-improvement culture telling you what you should want, but a witness. Someone watching the wanting arise with genuine interest and without immediate condemnation, noticing its quality and its texture and its origin, and asking, quietly, whether this particular want is pointing towards something real or towards something the mechanism manufactured. The third thing, and this is the one that most treatments of this subject either omit entirely or address too briefly to be useful, is that the want must be redirected, not suppressed. Because desire is not the problem, desire is the engine. What you have been dealing with throughout this entire book is not too much wanting, but misdirected wanting. The mechanism aimed at targets that cannot ultimately satisfy the deeper need it is expressing. What is the deeper need? In most cases, not all, but most, the chronic pursuit of the unavailable is not actually a desire for that specific person or thing. It is a desire for a particular feeling, the feeling of mattering enough to be chosen, of being seen fully and found worthy, of earning something that once earned confirms something you have been uncertain of for a very long time about your own value. The unavailable person or thing is a stand-in, a proxy, a way of staging, over and over, a drama whose real subject is not them but you. Your worth, your adequacy, your right to be wanted back. And when you begin to understand this, when you can feel it as true rather than just think it as a concept, the question of what to redirect the want toward becomes, if not simple, at least coherent. You redirect it inward first, toward the genuine development of a life that is full enough, interesting enough, self-determined enough, that your availability to others flows from abundance rather than need, not the performed fullness of someone manufacturing unavailability as strategy, the actual thing, built through actual investment in the work and the relationships and the interior life that genuinely matter to you. You redirect it toward people who are available, not as a last resort, but as an expression of genuine interest. And you practice, consciously and repeatedly, and against the initial grain of the nervous system, allowing that availability to feel like something other than a warning sign. Practice receiving warmth without immediately testing it. Practice trusting consistency without immediately trying to create uncertainty in it to make it feel more real. And you redirect it toward the question that the mechanism has been displacing for as long as you have been running it. The quiet, destabilizing, ultimately liberating question that sits at the center of every chapter in this book, and that only you can answer. Not how do I get what I want, but who am I when I'm not in pursuit of something I can't have? Because that person, the one who exists in the absence of the chase, in the ordinary, unglamorous available present, is the one the mechanism has been keeping you too busy to meet. And they are, it turns out, the only foundation stable enough to want from in a way that actually leads somewhere worth going. Reprogramming the want doesn't make you want less. It makes the wanting honest. And honest wanting, for perhaps the first time in your life, might actually be capable of leading you somewhere the chase never could, toward something real, available, and genuinely yours. Chapter 12, The Awakened Appetite, Living Beyond the Illusion. This is not the ending you were promised. There is no arrival here. No moment where everything that came before resolves into peace, where the machinery goes quiet and the wanting finally, mercifully, stops pulling in directions that cost more than they return. That book, the one that ends with the reader feeling healed, concluded, delivered safely to the other side of their psychology, is a different book, a more comfortable one. One that, ironically, you would have closed and forgotten within a week, because comfort, as you now understand better than almost anyone who hasn't read these pages, does not produce the neurological engagement that stays with you. What this chapter offers is something rarer and considerably more demanding than peace. It offers the particular, irreversible clarity of someone who has seen the mechanism and cannot unsee it, who has stood inside the architecture of their own desire and watched it operate in real time, with full awareness of every moving part. Who knows, now, that the wanting will keep coming, that the pull toward the scarce, the uncertain, the just out of reach is not a phase to be outgrown, or a wound to be fully healed, but a permanent feature of the psychological landscape that must be navigated with eyes open rather than sleepwalked through with eyes closed. This clarity is not comfortable, but it is, in the most meaningful sense of the word, a form of freedom. Let's be honest about who you are right now. At the end of this book, you are not fixed. The pattern that ran through your wanting before you opened the first page is still there, still wired into the neural pathways that scarcity carved through years of reinforcement, still embedded in the attachment template your earliest relationships wrote, still capable of activating with the same urgency and the same subjective authority it has always had. Knowledge does not dissolve the grooves. It does not rewire you overnight. It does not produce the clean cinematic transformation where the protagonist, having understood their flaw, simply stops expressing it. What it does, what it can do if you let it, is introduce friction. The productive, generative friction of awareness meeting automation. The slight but significant delay between the desire firing and your full surrender to its momentum. The moment, brief, imperfect, sometimes arriving only after you've already done the thing you now recognize as the pattern, where something in you watches the mechanism with enough distance to say, I see you, I know what you are, and I am deciding, consciously and with full information, what to do next. That moment is everything. It is the entire distance between a life lived inside the mechanism and a life lived alongside it. The awakened appetite is not the absence of appetite. It is appetite that knows itself, hunger that can distinguish at least some of the time between what it has been conditioned to crave and what it actually, in the deepest and most honest register of the self, needs. This distinction is not always available. There will be times, there will be many times, when the mechanism is faster than the awareness, when the pull is stronger than the pause, when you find yourself deep inside a familiar pattern before you've registered that it has begun. This is not failure. This is the texture of actual change, as opposed to the fantasy of it. The fantasy of change is sudden, total, and permanent. The reality is incremental, partial, and requires continuous recommitment. The person who has genuinely integrated the contents of this book does not stop falling for the unavailable. They fall with greater awareness. They recover with greater speed. They spend less time in the story that the mechanism is reality, and more time in the clear-eyed recognition that they are, once again, running an old program in a new situation, and that the program, however convincingly it presents itself as truth, can be interrupted. Here is what the awakened life actually looks like. Not the idealized version, the real one. It looks like noticing the pull towards someone who is inconsistent and feeling it fully. Not suppressing it, not shaming yourself for it, not performing detachment, and then asking, with genuine curiosity, what the pull is made of. Whether the intensity reflects something real and present, or something old and familiar wearing new clothes, and then making a choice, however imperfect, that is at least partially informed by that inquiry, rather than entirely driven by the mechanism. It looks like encountering genuine availability. Warmth that doesn't require earning, consistency that doesn't require vigilance, devotion that arrives without drama, and sitting in the discomfort of it without immediately creating uncertainty to make it feel more real. Practicing against the grain of every neurological habit, the tolerance of something good that is simply unambiguously present. It looks like catching yourself mid-rationalization, in the moment of constructing the story that explains why this particular unavailable thing is worth the cost, and holding the story at arm's length long enough to see its seams, not necessarily abandoning the pursuit. Sometimes, even with full awareness, the choice to stay is the right one. But making the choice consciously, with open eyes, rather than surrendering to the elaborate justification machine that has been protecting your wanting from scrutiny your entire life. It looks, in short, like being a person rather than a mechanism. Imperfect, inconsistent, frequently returning to old patterns, but capable, in a way you weren't before, of witnessing yourself with something close to honesty. And there is a darker truth still, one that belongs in this final chapter precisely because most final chapters would omit it in service of a cleaner conclusion. The awakening is not a destination, it is a practice. And it is a practice that requires you to give up something you may not have realized you were attached to. Something that the mechanism provided that felt, for all its cost, like a kind of meaning. The chase, for all its pain, gave you a story. A protagonist, you, moving towards something that mattered, investing in an outcome that felt significant, living at the heightened register that pursuit produces. Ordinary life, without the chase, without the consuming preoccupation of the unavailable, without the dramatic stakes of wanting something you might not be able to have. Ordinary life can feel at first like a diminishment, like the volume has been turned down, like something essential has been removed. What has actually been removed is the noise that was drowning out the signal, because underneath the wanting, underneath the mechanism and the patterns and the decades of chasing the unavailable in its 1,000 different forms, there is a self that has been present all along, quieter than the wanting, less urgent, not producing the neurochemical fireworks that the chase generates, but real, continuous, present in the ordinary moments that the pursuit was always too loud to let you fully inhabit. That self does not need the chase to feel real. It does not require scarcity to assign value. It does not depend on the mechanism to generate meaning, because it has access to something the mechanism never provided and cannot replicate. The actual present tense experience of being alive in a moment that is not in service of some future attainment. This is the invitation of the awakened appetite, not the end of desire, not the transcendence of wanting, but the redirection of it toward the present, toward the real, toward the people and the work and the experiences that reveal their value, not by receding, but by remaining, by being genuinely, unspectacularly, beautifully available to you. The mechanism will still fire, the pull will still come. The closed door will still draw the eye more reliably than the open one. But you will know now what is on the other side of every closed door you have ever stood in front of, spending yourself against the wood, certain that what was just out of reach was the thing that would finally make everything complete. You were always on the other side. The fruit was never forbidden. The hunger was never the problem. What was missing, what has always been missing, was not the next thing to chase. It was the willingness to stop long enough to want what is already, quietly, entirely yours. You made it to the end, but let's be honest. A part of you is already trying to forget what you read here. That's normal. The mind protects its illusions because illusions feel safer than the exposed machinery underneath them. Here's what happens if you close this book and walk back into the comfortable fog. You keep chasing, you keep rationalizing, you keep mistaking intensity for meaning, unavailability for value, and the ache of wanting for proof that something matters. The slot machine keeps spinning. The spell holds. And here's what happens if you stay awake. You become genuinely harder to manipulate. Not because you build walls, but because you can finally see the architecture of influence as it's being constructed around you. You start to want differently. Not less passionately, but more honestly. You stop handing your nervous system over to whoever is willing to withhold from you. That shift is quiet. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but it changes everything. This is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of a different one. If something in these pages cracks something open for you, don't let it close. The ideas here are part of a larger, ongoing exploration. One that goes deeper into the psychology of influence, self-awareness, and what it actually means to move through the world with your eyes open. Follow along. Share this with someone who needs to read it. Leave a thought, a reaction, a question, even an argument. The conversation is the point. Because the moment you engage with these ideas publicly, you make it harder to unsee them privately. And that's exactly where the real work begins. The fruit was never forbidden. You were just never told who built the fence.